to Bible Study Hub. I'm Ann Wiggins, and I'm so happy to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, whether live or later, however you're joining. We're just always thankful to have you. Well, we are in Genesis chapter 41 tonight, and I just want you to know ahead of time, this is going to be heavy on history, culture, that type of thing. So if you love that type of thing, you're going to really enjoy tonight's study. If you hate history and culture, I don't know what to tell you. You may want to tune out because that's what we're going to talk about. But it just really enriches our understanding of the text when you kind of put yourself back in that time period, in their culture, and kind of know the history of what's going on. At least that's what I think. Well, we are in the middle of the story of Joseph. He's an amazing person. He has suffered so much. He was sold into slavery by his brothers who wanted to originally kill him and then decided they would do that to get the money. He ends up serving in the household of Potiphar, who's a really high-ranking official in Egypt. But Potiphar's wife, how should we say, has the hots for Joseph? Is that okay to say on Bible Study Hub? And she decides she's going to seduce him. But Joseph is such an honorable and godly man of integrity that he just won't succumb to it. And she gets more and more intense about it until one day she grabs him and insists that he, does the deed with her. And he literally pulls his arms out of his sleeves and leaves his coat in her hands and runs out. Well, you would think that that type of behavior would just be so rewarded because how noble of him. But no, unfortunately, she decides, feeling very scorned, I'm sure, to get revenge on him by telling everybody, including her husband, look at what I have. You know how I got his coat? Because he was trying to rape me, is what she basically said. So Potiphar ends up throwing Joseph, who did nothing wrong, into prison. And we said last week that just had to feel so unfair and oh God, where are you? But even in the midst of that suffering, Joseph never turns his back on the Lord. He continues to serve faithfully, and he ends up rising to the level in prison as a prisoner. He basically is given the duties of the prison warden. And now he's in charge of all the prisoners. By the way, he doesn't get paid for that. The guy who's supposed to be doing that job, he's getting whatever their payment arrangement was. Joseph's doing all the work. And that had to be hard too. And he does this, my friends, for 10 years. We can say that quickly, but 10 years goes by very slowly when you're in a dungeon. And at the end of those 10 years, he ends up interpreting the dreams of two key prisoners, a baker and a cupbearer. And the dreams that he interprets happen precisely the way that Joseph interprets them. Now that happens because God obviously is giving Joseph the correct interpretations of these dreams. And so he says to the cupbearer, who's going to be exonerated, and he was, please, when you get back to your service, will you remember me to Pharaoh? I shouldn't be here. I've been sold. I've been maligned here. I shouldn't be in prison. Please, would you mention me to Pharaoh? The cupbearer gets back into his position and zips it up. He says nothing. And that had to feel incredibly unfair. 2 more years go by like this. So that's a very long time to be in prison. He could be very bitter by this time. He could have said, God, if this is how you want to play it, I don't think I want to serve you anymore because serving you is not working out for me. But he doesn't. He continues to be faithful. So let's pick it up in chapter 41, verses 1-8. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. These are beefy cows. They look healthy and good. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke and he fell asleep. So this has happened to you before, right? You wake up from a dream and whoo, that was weird. And then you doze back off. So this is what happened. He goes back to sleep. And verse 5, he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. So just scrawny, not healthy. And the thin ears swallowed up all of the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So, as I said at the beginning, if you kind of understand the religion, the culture, the history behind this, it just really comes alive. So, let's talk about a little bit of that. First of all, the Egyptians were polytheists, as you probably either knew or guessed. Most pagans in that time were, if not all of them. They worshipped over 100 deities, but there was one goddess and one god in particular that really have significance where Pharaoh's dream is concerned. So let's talk about the goddess. The goddess was named Heather, not Heather, Heather. Here, I'll pop it up so you can see how that's spelled. That's how they spell it. Now, Heather was the daughter of the sun god, whose name was Ra, I guess R-A. I don't know how you pronounce that. And the Egyptians worshipped this goddess for over 3,000 years. Let me go over here because there is a picture that I want to show you. And while you're looking at the picture of Heather, that's Heather on the left, a little statue that they excavated in some sort of archaeological dig. And then remember last week we talked about a seal or a signet, and sometimes they were rolling ones. And you can see somebody found a rolling signet of Heather. And so you can kind of see how they depicted her. Well, anyway, Heather was believed to have several important functions. First of all, as you can tell by looking, she was depicted as a cow. She was often visualized as a big, gigantic cow that stretched over the heavens, and she kind of took care of the Milky Way in the sky, which the Egyptians called the Nile in the sky. In other words, the Nile River, but up in the sky. So her most vital function, they believed as Egyptians, was causing the Nile to overflow its banks every year, which provided really fertile soil, and they would grow all their crops in this fertile soil. So if the Nile did not flood its banks, Egypt had no ability to harvest food because that was where all the good soil to plant and harvest came from. So the most striking, though, relevance, I think, to Pharaoh's dream here is that in some instances, she would actually not appear as one, but as 7 Hathors, always healthy, always looking good. Starting to put something together here. Now, that was the goddess. There was also a god that they worshiped, small g god, and that god's name was, I believe you pronounce this, Neper. Neper looks downright scary to me personally, but Heather was hardly a treat to look at either. Anyway, again, a little statue that was excavated somewhere in an archaeological dig. Now, this was the grain god. And you can almost see like his little hat almost looks like, I don't know, an ear of corn or a stalk of grain or something like that. So he represented the prosperity brought by their crops, their wheat, their corn, whatever it was that they were raising. And obviously, you can imagine not only was the grain super important to them as far as just eating it and sustaining them, but they also used it in place of money. It was kind of their trading unit. So what we have in this dream, so back to the dream now, you have 7 cows. Would it be a stretch to say possibly Hathors, right? The goddess Heather, plump, healthy, good, and then 7 scrawny, sick, skeleton-looking cows come and eat up the big, plump Heather cows. Then he goes back to sleep and he dreams about, Neper, the grain, it's big, it's plump, it looks great, it's healthy, it's ready for harvest. And then these sick, blighted stalks of corn come and devour the healthy ones. So Pharaoh wakes up and he is not feeling very good about what he saw. I have a question for you, though. So I want you to start typing weigh in group. In addition to the prophetic meaning, which we're about to get to because Joseph's going to give him the meaning through the, God giving it to him, What message initially here might God be sending Pharaoh? Or maybe I could even flip that around and say, what message do you think that Pharaoh was receiving that he could understand, at least in part, by this dream, so that when he woke up, he was worried? What do you think he's, I don't know, I'm having a hard time asking the question. I know what I want to say, but for some reason I can't seem to um, get it out. Robin. A play on words. I have to put it up. I can't help it, Robin. If you're going to put up funny stuff, I'm going to pop it up. Not Potiphar, but Hotiphar. Nice work. All right. So what do you think Pharaoh is receiving initially on his own as what this dream might mean? So Emily says his interpretation, maybe plagues are coming as a punishment for a grave mistake. Okay. She makes a really good point, and that is that very much in this time, people believed that if they did something that offended the little g gods or goddesses, that those gods or goddesses would definitely punish them. So if something bad happened to you, it was probably your fault. You did something to make them mad. That was excellent. Loretta says his rich lifestyle is coming to an end. Okay, maybe he was concerned about that. I never thought about it. That's really good. Judy says that he could be overtaken by someone weaker. Okay, another great thought there. Just to be clear, I think you all know this. The Bible doesn't tell us these things, but I kind of like to try to get into the minds sometimes of the characters. Like, what are the possibilities of what they may have been thinking if you were in their shoes? Margie says the symbols of fertility appeared with a message that the land would soon be less fertile. Okay, which is so true. And that is actually one of the actual interpretations of the dream. Dottie says the weak will overtake the strong. Okay, great. I love everything that you're saying there. I think for Pharaoh too, it's possible that if he saw his healthy, good, strong gods being devoured by a like kind that he did not know what that was, to me, I just wondered if he thought to himself, because they have high, it's hard for us to think because we're not I hope we're not polytheists, right? None of us are. But for them, they had like degrees of gods and goddesses. Some were more powerful than others. Some were good, some were bad, some were back and forth. Some were male, some were female, some went back and forth between male and female. So there wasn't this feeling that we get, or this knowledge that we have that our God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he is all powerful. They did not have that concept. So I wonder if he may have thought to himself, there is an attack on my gods. There is another God out there that I don't quite know who this is, who's devouring my gods. And that bodes really, really badly for me. Whatever it was, he wakes up, and let's just read verse 8 again, just to go back. Verse 8 said, so in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and you can now understand why he would be so troubled by this dream. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Okay, so when I read that, my first thought and question was, how is that? Like, you're calling in all your magicians. It's their job to interpret dreams, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, do you remember back in Daniel when we studied it and King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream and he called in all of his magicians and wise men? And do you remember what he did to them? He said, you tell me the dream that I had. And once you can tell me my own dream, because he didn't tell them what it was, he didn't disclose it. You can tell me my dream, I'll let you interpret it. And they said, nobody can do that. You can't expect us to tell you the dream. Like, tell us the dream and then we'll interpret. He said, no. And the reason he did that was because I don't want you making up stuff. I want to know for sure that what you say is true. And it ends up being Daniel that's able to both tell him the dream and accurately interpret the dream. But Pharaoh doesn't do that. So what was it that kept those magicians and those wise men from just simply gathering together and coming up with some sort of explanation? Well, as you probably anticipated, the answer again lies in history. So once again, let me go over to an ancient document here. You can see it's been sort of pieced together. This that you're looking at is called the Ancient Egyptian Book of Dreams, and it is the oldest manual of dream interpretations in the world. It contains right around 108 to 110 ancient dreams, and then within it describes about 78 activities and emotions and that type of thing surrounding these dreams. So while we can't say that this particular book of dreams was around during this time period that Joseph is in right now, what we can say is that what you're looking at was uncovered from about 1300 BC, which is about 400 years after Joseph. And at that time, that book was considered to be full of ancient dream interpretations. In other words, by the time this book comes around 400 years later, they consider that book to be ancient. So that tells us that it is very possible and even probable that they either had that book or the predecessor to that book full of dream interpretations, which, if you know that, it all of a sudden makes sense as to why these guys were not able to say to Pharaoh, oh, we can tell you what your dreams mean, because he would have expected them to go to whatever their dream book is, whether it was this one or maybe an earlier predecessor to it, and show him, okay, here's the dream or the genre of dream, and here's what it means. Would you like to know what some of the dreams meant in the story? Because I think this is kind of funny. It kind of cracked me up. So that little book that I just showed you, so it has like good and bad interpretation. So it says in the book, if a man sees himself in a dream, so if it's about you, if you see yourself dead, that is a good omen. It means a long life. Like, how did they come up with that? Somehow seeing yourself as dead does not seem like a good omen to me, but that's now you've probably had this dream many times as I have, but if you're eating crocodile flesh, there it is. That's also a good omen, meaning that you will become a village official. No idea. If you are bringing in cattle, good omen, you will evangelize the spirit of the community. I don't even know what that means, but I'm getting this off the internet. If you are plunging into cold waters, good omen, absolution of all of your ills. But on the flip side, if you see yourself in a dream, like with a naked behind, you're going to be an orphan. So that would be a bad omen. So if you have a naked dream, no good for you. If you are putting your face on the ground, also bad omen. Something is going to happen that the dead people in your life want, like they're coming for you. This is horrible. There's some others that are bad. I'm going to just kind of skip. So anyway, all that to say, those are the types of dreams probably in the book. And so their gods just took a royal beating in his dream, and they have nothing in the book. So they can't tell him anything. And they're all beside themselves. They need answers. They know that this is not good. And yet there's nothing that they can do because there's no dream interpretation in the book that they can go to and figure out. And all of a sudden, remember the cupbearer? You remember when Joseph said, please remember me to Pharaoh. I shouldn't be in prison. All of a sudden, the bell rings in the cupbearer's mind. This would be a good time to mention Joseph to Pharaoh because that guy interpreted my dreams right. So let's find out what he says. In verses 9 to 13, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. Kind of like, oops, I was supposed to tell you something that I just now remembered. Right. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. In other words, two different dreams. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office and the baker was hanged. Well, this is a couple of years later, but it's God's perfect timing. We kind of ended our study last week by just saying God's timing is not always our timing. And it's possible that God had Joseph in a holding pattern in prison for the right moment, and all of a sudden it's like, go, and it's time. And so here we go. Now it's going to get fun. Verses 14 to 16. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself, because you know the Egyptians really did not do facial hair for the most part. If you've ever seen like drawings and stuff, they're pretty clean shaven. So he shaved himself, changed his clothes. He came in before Pharaoh. I wonder if he just thought to himself, what on earth is going to happen to me now? You know, he didn't know what was coming. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, by the way, notice what he does not say. Yes, I can. I'm very gifted that way. Yes, Pharaoh, I will do this for you if you promise to do something for me, which is to let me out of prison. He doesn't say anything like this. Verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. I don't have the interpretations. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Isn't that a fabulous response? This is how we know that Joseph just remained so faithful to the Lord, even in the face of intense suffering. Because when it came that moment where the door was just cracked, that he himself could push it open and jet through and get out of the suffering, he still puts himself in the hands of God. The God who allowed him to be thrown in the pit, the God who allowed him to be sold into slavery, the God who allowed him to be brought into Potiphar's household, the God who allowed him to be falsely accused, and the God who allowed him to be put into prison unjustly for over a decade. He puts himself squarely in the hands of that God with full trust and assurance that he is still good. We could almost stop right there for tonight and say, let's just marinate in that thought for a minute. Is that not applicable to our lives? I don't know about you. I have never suffered like that, ever. I've had periods of suffering, as have you, because if you live in this fallen world long enough, you will suffer. That's just the way it is. We live in a sinful, fallen situation here. But I've never been through anything like that. And I just pray, if I ever did, that I would be as faithful as Joseph has been and continues to be. What a character to aspire to. My goodness. Well, let's go on, see what happens here. Verses 17 to 24. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. He starts to recount the dream back. 7 cows, plump and attractive, perhaps heather, I'm just going to throw that in there, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And they were thin, ugly cows. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as the beginning. Then I awoke. So a little bit of additional information. Those 7 scrawny cows eat the big ones, but they're not any healthier. They're not any bigger. They're still scrawny. That is disturbing. Verse 22. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Well, now that we kind of know what Pharaoh very well may have been thinking about his gods, it's very poignant that Pharaoh would go to Joseph to help him interpret this, because maybe, just maybe, if Joseph's God gives him the right interpretation, then maybe, just maybe, it was Joseph's God who actually gave him the dream in the first place. Maybe when I said like kinds, and I don't mean like equal gods, but he's having a dream about his gods. Maybe he's thinking to himself, there might be another God out there who is actually superior to my gods, who's going to do something. And I need to know what it is, because I don't think I have any power over this other deity or this other entity. Does that make sense? Verses 25 to 26. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. In other words, he's saying, I know you had 2 dreams, but they are the same dream, just two different stories to tell you the very same message. Verse 26, the 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. So he just makes a point again of just saying, just so you understand, you're not having two separate dreams, you're having one dream. It's just in two different parts. Verses 27 to 28. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So Joseph just says, okay, we're just going to establish that the number 7 in every context stands for 7 years, whether it's the good or the bad. 7 ears, 7 cows, whatever it is 7 years. Now he's going to break it down into a little bit more detail for us. Verses 29 to 32. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all of the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that is to follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So this is really an incredible interpretation. He says, here's what you're going to have. You're going to have 7 years of just incredible overflow bounty. After the 7 years, you're going to have 7 years of the most severe famine you've ever experienced or heard of in your life. So severe will that famine be that nobody will even remember the really, really good years. It will consume the land. And he says, the fact that God gave you the same dream twice means his mind is made up. There's no getting out of it. There's no getting around it. It is about to happen, and it is about to happen very soon. Then what Joseph says next, I just think is fascinating. Let's go on to verses 33 to 36. He goes on and he says, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. I'm going to stop there for just a second. I don't want you to miss this. Joseph just submitted his resume. Do you remember back in the prison, we mentioned this earlier, when the cupbearer is, Joseph says, the dream by God means you're going to be exonerated, you're going to be put back into your position. And then he says to this guy, he goes after it, like, please remember me. Would you talk to Pharaoh for me? I shouldn't be in here. Joseph self-advocates. He's not shy about doing that. Now, it hasn't worked out for him until now, but he's not afraid to step up to the plate and say, I need something. I want something. I want you to do something. And so what he's saying right now is you need a wise and discerning man to set over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh has to know, like, he's going, and the spotlight is shining on this wise and discerning. Nobody else could interpret the dream, but I just did. Let's go on to verse 34. Let Pharaoh proceed. This is still Joseph talking. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land to take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. So in other words, let somebody over Egypt be in charge of collecting a 20% grain tax. That would probably be the easiest way to say that. Verse 35. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Joseph has trained for this moment his entire life. Way back, remember when he was given firstborn status because Reuben had disqualified himself and his father then had his pick of the litter as to who he wanted to put into that status. He chose Joseph, and Joseph became the overseer of his father's estate. He was in charge of being the mediator between his father and all of his brothers. He was in charge of running the family household, running the family business. So he had, kind of on a smaller scale, the same type of situation way back then. Then he gets carted off to Egypt and he's promoted to Potiphar's house. In fact, he's so amazing at what he does that Potiphar ends up going, hey, I don't need to worry about any of this stuff because Joseph is great at it and everything he does turns out wonderfully. I'm going to give him charge of my whole household. Now, all of a sudden, Joseph is over more stuff than he ever was with his father. Now he's overseeing this official. Of course, that ends up getting him thrown into prison, as we said. But even in prison, God permits Joseph to be promoted to like top dog prisoner slash warden. And now he's in charge of all the prisoners. So he's had it hard with his brothers. Then he got to Potiphar's household. I don't know how difficult that was outside of the wife situation. Now he's in this prison situation. These are not easy people to work with. But somehow, some way, Joseph does that. Now, for sure, God has just given him natural leadership talents and abilities. There is no doubt in my mind. This is the type of guy that you could put him into any situation and he's going to just rise to the top. You know, people like that. There aren't a lot of them, but there are a few. I would say I have a husband who 100% is like that. I used to tell him all the time, I still do from time to time, if somebody threw you in prison, you'd be running the prison within weeks because it's just the kind of person he is. He just has this incredible talent and gift for leading and for leadership. So for sure, Joseph had that going on. But this is so far beyond just talent and ability. This is God prepping Joseph throughout his life for an incredible feat that he's going to have to pull off. And right now, he goes to Pharaoh and he says, I'm the man for the job. You need to appoint someone. Here's how it needs to go. What do you think? Well, let's find out what Pharaoh thinks about that. Verses 37 to 45. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house. He says, you've got the job. You asked for it. You've proven you can do it. You got it. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will be greater than you. In other words, the only greater thing than you will be me. You don't get to be me, but you're my number two guy. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Wow. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand. That was, like their signature, and put it on Joseph's hand. He just gave him authority to sign documents legally for Pharaoh. Wow, that's unbelievable. And clothed him in garments of linen and put a gold chain about his neck. I'll stop right there. Linen was the garment or the fabric, I should say, of choice of the Egyptians. They made it out of flax. It was white because it was cheaper to just leave it the color it came out, which was white. It's kind of a little bit of a coarser, but it was still soft, just kind of not super dense, I guess, as far as the weaving goes, unless you were royalty. And then you got a beautiful, soft linen, and they would thread like dyed threads and make designs and things throughout. So he got like the really good linen, I'm sure. The gold chain about his neck was just Pharaoh's sign that, yes, this is my pick. It was kind of like his uniform. So they had to do what he said. And he made him ride in his second chariot. What is that? Air Force Two. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. You are the one who makes all the decisions. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name, oh boy, Zaphanath Paneah. I have no idea if I said that right, but we're just going to go with that. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, no relationship to Potiphar, by the way, just a common name. Potipharah, priest of On. That was a location. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So he just goes and he makes sure that Joseph is known throughout the land as this is my pick. This is my guy. Whatever he says you have to do. He has my authority. He can sign my documents. He rides behind me in chariot number 2. That's how much trust Pharaoh put in Joseph. I mean, wow. And I don't believe that that level of trust came simply because Joseph was able to tell him the dream. I mean, it hasn't come true yet. So Pharaoh doesn't know for sure if he's right. But I have a feeling that it came to his attention that this man had acted with the utmost character and integrity all the years that he had been in Egypt and all the things that he had done and the other dreams that he had obviously interpreted as we read. Now, if you're worried about his marriage to this Egyptian from some priest of a pagan god, actually, he was the priest of the sun god in the land or the like county, whatever you want to call it, city of On, O-N. Um, there's no indication that this woman led Joseph astray, that God was displeased with it. I mean, he had no options here for marriage. And remember, in these days, marriage was very much an alliance. So it was important to Pharaoh that he gave that type of strong internal alliance with Joseph and one of his priest's daughters. We hope that maybe, just maybe, that woman came to faith in the real God because she was married to Joseph. They will have 2 sons, as we will find out. And those 2 sons do become 2 of the tribes of Israel. So it seems as though God blessed that union. He blessed that with sons, and then those sons became 2 of the 12 tribes. Okay, let me run down my notes. I'm trying to go fast here. All right, let's pick it up in verses 46 to 49. We're almost done. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, still relatively young for that type of position. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it because it could not be measured. They literally like ran out of ways of counting it. They just couldn't measure that much. They couldn't count that high. I don't know what it was. There was so much, like the grains of sand on the seashore. You can imagine how much that was. Now, that all sounds relatively simple, like, okay, just go, gather but think how intricate this had to be. Think of how much skill Joseph would have needed to pull this off. This is really a feat. One second. I have a little picture over here. Another one, last one for tonight. That is one of the storage units that they believe that Joseph stored the grain in. So you can see just by looking at it. And by the way, some of the stairs you can tell have obviously been redone over the years, but the very top stairs there, it's kind of the top right side, look to me to be more original. So they would have looked like that. And they would just start dumping the grain in, which was really smart. I guess I always pictured that they put it in silos like we do, but I didn't know how they got it in there. Well, they didn't put it in tall buildings, excuse me, because they didn't have any way of getting it up to the top like we do. So they would dump it into like pits such as this. To end this up, he also collects in each city for itself, which I think is also brilliant. So rather than having it all go to a central location, he has every city kind of have their own big granary, if you want to call it that. And they are responsible to fill up their own granary. Well, this is brilliant for a number of reasons. First of all, so when they need it, the people over in this city don't have to travel all the way over to this city to get their grain. It's right there for them. Also, if there are any varmints, bugs, mice, something else, some disease that hits the grain, it doesn't wipe out the entire country's storehouses of it. It would be a localized problem, not something that was extensive to the entire country. So Joseph has really, really thought this through. Also, the people of the city need to take ownership for what they are producing and saving for later. So they have ownership in that whole thing rather than just it's being collected federally by Egypt somewhere. So he's an excellent, excellent manager. We're going to conclude there. We will pick this up again next week, hopefully, Lord willing. But I want to leave you with this thought. When we suffer, kind of back to the suffering theme, when we go through suffering in our lives, whether it's short term, long term, all suffering is temporary. Have you ever really thought about that? All of it. Even if the suffering that you're going through ends in you're going home to be with the Lord, it's still temporary because at the end of it, you get to go be with Jesus. If it's not something that's fatal, and hopefully it's not, we'd like to keep you around. But even that will be temporary. It does end someday. And as we are going through the suffering, we almost never know what God is doing until down the road when we turn around and we look back. So, in other words, when Joseph was going through being thrown in the pit, sold to the Ishmaelites, sold to Potiphar, worked in Potiphar's house, wished he were back home, didn't like it, gets thrown into prison. All of this suffering that happened, he had no idea what God was doing. He didn't know he was in training. He didn't know that God had him to be number 2 in the entire land of Egypt. I mean, this is like vice president, but way more than vice president, because Pharaoh basically says, I'm taking my hands off the wheel and you've got the wheel, right? That's what he's saying here. So Joseph is technically number 2, but he's functioning as the number 1 guy. He didn't know any of that was going to happen. And this is why I'm saying this, because none of us like suffering. I know I hate it. I hate it so much. I hate talking about it because I'm always afraid, I'll get done talking about it and then I'll get to go through something that I don't want to go through. None of us like it. But as I said before, if you live in this life long enough, something bad will happen. It's just inevitable because we live in a fallen world. I think it would help. It's never easy. It's never going to be fun. It's never going to be palatable. But I think it helps if we can find a purpose in it. And even if you can't see that purpose at the time, to have the faith in God and hope in him, that you would be able to say, okay, I don't know now why this is happening, but my hope and my prayer is that someday God would be gracious enough to let me look in the rear view mirror and go, oh my goodness, he was training me. I didn't know it. Oh my goodness, he was moving me. I was here, but I needed to be here. And he did that. Oh my goodness, the people I'm able to mentor and help now because I've been where they are. Oh my goodness, there's a ministry that I have that I would never have had before. Oh, wow, I understand things I wouldn't have understood before. Wow, there was character developed in me that I would not have developed any other way except through the suffering. We can so often, as we're either in the midst of it, but towards the tail end, or maybe it's one of those that ends and it's over and it's behind us, we can turn around and we can see the purpose of God. And the story of Joseph is the most encouraging story because we get to see this all transpire and walk with him as he goes through all this crazy stuff that's awful. And we read it in a second. 10 years go by. He had to live every single day of those 10 years in that dungeon. That was a long, long time. But he was faithful. And in the end, God was also faithful. And I'm telling you, if you are suffering right now, if you're afraid, if you're going through something difficult, there is purpose in your suffering. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you'll ever know either. But we believe that God, for those of us who know him, right? That there is that purpose, that God does truly work all things together for our good to those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. Book of Romans, I believe that is chapter 8. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. I know we're getting close to Christmas. My hope, my prayer is to do one more week here on Bible Study Hub before Christmas. And then we'll take a break and we'll just enjoy the holidays and then we'll reconvene a bit after that. So have a wonderful week. Thank you for being part of our Facebook group. If you're not in Facebook group, but you have a Facebook account, you should definitely join Bible Study Hub. I am blown away by the level of love and care and concern and kindness that I see on that page. If you have a prayer request, you want to pop it on that page, because people who have never met you will literally surround you with prayer. And I see it every day on Bible Study Hub on Facebook. So thank you for being so wonderful. And if you ever need to watch a video later, Bible Study Hub on YouTube is probably the fastest and easiest way to find the one that you missed, because they're all in order. All right, I love you all, and I will see you again next Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Lord willing. Bye-bye.